Hello and welcome back. Let's dive right in. So, when I first heard about repricing, I didn't feel informed at all. I actually felt fear. I felt like there was some they waiting for the right moment to flip a switch, even like the game was rigged, like the real rules were hidden from me. Like by the time I heard about it, I was already depending on that financial system itself. And I have to be honest, my first reaction wasn't curiosity. It was, I don't want anything to do with this. Because not having the language for money or finance turns mystery into threat. And for a very long time, money has lived in that space for me exactly like a threat. Something that moves, something that affects everything, but something I never really thought of how to understand or even introduce to what it was. So repricing didn't sound neutral. It sounded like power being exercised without explanation. But then I slowed things down. And instead of listening to outside narratives, I started looking at the mechanics. I started asking, what does repricing actually mean? Outside of fear, outside of hype, outside of even timing myths. And once I had language, the fear didn't disappear, but it softened. Because what I saw wasn't a switch, it was more like a process. What I learned next is the part that changed everything for me. And what that was is repricing is not an event. It doesn't happen on a certain date. It doesn't arrive with a headline. And it definitely doesn't come with a countdown clock. Repricing is what happens when the way people value something slowly changes. And the price has no choice but to catch up at a later point. That's it. No switch, no secret meaning, no moment where they decide it's time. Just movement, quiet, gradual, and often absolutely uncomfortable to watch. Because most of the time, repricing looks like nothing happening. And here's how I am drawing that conclusion. Price only reflects what can be traded right now, not what is being accumulated, not what is being repositioned, and not what is being prepared for future use. So when people say nothing is happening, what they're usually saying, in my opinion, is nothing is moving fast enough to be visible. And this was my experience for so many years in this space. But repricing doesn't care about visibility, it responds to pressure. A clear example of this right now is gold. Central banks around the world are quietly increasing their gold reserves. Not because gold suddenly became exciting, but because and it's not even because retail investors piled in. That's not what I'm saying. But because in uncertain environments, institutions look for assets that sit outside political risk. And the more I think on it, repricing feels less like someone changing the rules and more like a referee watching the game. The play is already happening. The trades are being made. Use is increasing. Behavior is also shifting. The referee doesn't create the action itself. They just step in when the game has clearly changed and signal that it needs to be rescored, reevaluated. The whistle doesn't stop the game, it just resets the field. And the current repricing of gold didn't show up as an explosion in price overnight. It didn't announce itself. It did not arrive with excitement. What it did was it showed up quietly and reported reserve data and incremental increases and in decisions that didn't need explaining at the time they were made. Gold is one of the few assets institutions already understand. They already hold it. And they can adjust exposure to gold without redesigning the system itself. So this pressure and movement, that is repricing. Not drama, not prediction, just alignment. This is where I had to confront something really uncomfortable as I researched. I was expecting meaning to arrive the same way hype does. And what I mean by that is fast, loud, obvious. But I'm learning and seeing that systems don't move that way. They reprice through behavior, not announcements, through repetition, through policy, through accumulation, and also through information changing underneath the surface. So when I hear people talk about repricing like it's a future moment we're waiting to happen, I have to take a beat and recenter. Because repricing isn't coming. It's already happening, slowly and unevenly, and without asking for attention. And that's why understanding repricing matters to me. Because as soon as I began to see it as a process, I stopped looking for permission. I even stopped looking for the flip of a switch. And I now have begun watching where value is quietly being repositioned, long before price is forced to respond. This is where it stopped feeling abstract to me. Because repricing doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when the world itself starts to lean in a new direction. And right now, it's hard to ignore that the ground is moving. Every week, there's another headline: shifting alliances, new global trade agreements, political realignments, wars, tensions, sanctions. Countries are openly questioning old dependencies. It can feel like we're standing one misstep away from something very serious breaking. But here's the distinction that helped me breathe again. Instability doesn't automatically mean collapse. Sometimes it means reordering. Repricing pressure comes from a few forces acting at the same time, simultaneously. And once I started seeing those forces clearly, they stopped being abstract. They started showing up in real decisions that I saw. Not in theory, not even predictions, but actual behavior. Take, for instance, India. On January 27th, India of this year, India and the European Union announced the conclusion of a major trade agreement. After years of negotiation, bringing two of the largest economic regions in the world into closer, more direct partnership. And just a few months earlier, back in 2025, on May 6th, India and the United Kingdom announced a separate trade deal, one both governments have described as one of the most significant trade deals for India in modern history. What matters here isn't the fine print, and I'm not even going to go into it. It's the pattern. India isn't rejecting anyone. It isn't chasing or choosing a new side. It's building more direct paths at the same time. Less dependence on a single route as previously done. More flexibility in how trade and money move. More control if conditions change. This isn't chaos. This is actually preparation. That's what shifting trust looks like in real life. We're watching it every day. Another arm of repricing is liquidity stress, and it shows up just as quietly. Most people expect stress to look like something breaking or falling apart. But in financial systems, stress usually looks like things slowing down. Money takes longer to move. Costs show up where they didn't before. Institutions become more careful about timing, exposure, and counterparties. Over the past year, central banks around the world have had to make adjustments behind the scenes. Not because the system collapsed, but because parts of it were starting to feel tight. Like traffic thickening right before a traffic jam. Nothing dramatic, just friction building. And friction changes behavior. When liquidity feels less certain, systems start preparing, even if nothing has officially gone wrong yet. This is also where gold quietly re-enters the picture for me. Not as hype, not even as nostalgia, but as a behavior. Over the past few years, central banks around the world have been steadily increasing their gold reserves. Not because gold suddenly became exciting, like I said, but because institutions were looking for assets that don't rely on someone else's promise to work. So gold in itself doesn't need permission. It doesn't depend on a counterparty. It doesn't even care who's in charge. It just sits there, outside the system, while the system adjusts around it. The accumulation didn't show up as an overnight price spike. It showed up slowly, through steady buying, long-term positioning, reserve diversification, and only later are we seeing price begin to reflect the shift. That is repricing. When you put all of this together, for me, the pattern becomes super clear. Countries are diversifying relationships. Liquidity is getting tighter. Institutions are preparing not for collapse, but for a world where movement, trust, and coordination cannot be taken for granted anymore. Repricing isn't causing that change. It's responding to that. The world shifts first. Value follows later. And once I saw that, repricing stopped feeling like a threat. It started feeling like information. Gold helped me to explain and see why repricing works the way it does. But it also shows the limit of how far the old system can reach. And what I mean is, gold is stable. Gold is also neutral. Gold sits outside of political risk. But gold is heavy. It doesn't move. It doesn't settle transactions. It doesn't coordinate trade in real time. It doesn't help money travel faster when the world itself is speeding up. In a slower era, all of this was fine. Value could sit still while systems caught up. But in a faster, more connected world, value doesn't just need to exist. It needs to move. That's the shift I see and I think we're living through right now. Not away from stability, but towards stability that can travel. This is where repricing quietly extends beyond gold for me. Because once systems recognize the need for neutrality, the next question becomes unavoidable. How do we move value across borders between institutions without forcing trust where it no longer exists? How do you settle transactions without waiting days, without stacking intermediaries, without inheriting someone else's leverage? That's not a speculative question. It's actually an operational one. And it's the kind of questions systems only ask when the old answers stop working. This is why we're seeing more experimentation with digital settlement, more conversations about tokenized value, more infrastructure being tested quietly, not marketed loudly. Not because anyone is chasing excitement, but because coordination has become expensive and delay has become risky. I want to be clear about something here. This isn't about me predicting winners, and it's not about assuming outcomes. And it's not even about believing in a single solution. For me, it's about recognizing what kind of world is being built right now and what kind of tools that world naturally starts reaching for. Gold answered the question of where value could safely sit. What's being explored now answers a different question. How does value move cleanly, neutrally, and reliably in a world that no longer agrees who should be in charge? That's not a conclusion. It's actually a setup. And it's the point where repricing stops being theoretical and starts becoming visible in infrastructure. This is where XRP enters the picture for me. Not as a prediction, not even as a bet, and not as a promise of what will happen, but simply as an example of how some systems are being designed in response to the pressure we've been talking about and seeing. At its core, the XRP ledger was built around a simple idea. What if value could move as easily as information does? Not just stored, not parked, but transferred quickly, directly, and without needing a chain of intermediaries to agree first. That design choice matters so much in a world where trust is uneven and coordination is expensive. What stood out for me wasn't speed on its own, it's the neutrality. The XRP ledger doesn't represent a country. It doesn't belong to a central bank. It isn't tied to a single political system. XRP is designed to sit in between as a bridge, not as a destination. That's a very different role than money has traditionally played in our history of humanity. Most currencies are expressions of power. They carry influence. They carry conditions. A neutral bridge doesn't try to replace those systems. It just helps them talk to each other. This is also where repricing becomes easier to see without turning into a story about price, which is kind of funny. If systems begin to rely on infrastructure like this, even in limited ways, even in pilots, even behind the scenes, value doesn't need to rush. It accumulates quietly, just like gold did, just like trade relations do, and just like trust does. Price doesn't move first. Use and utility does. I'm not saying that this means something or anything has to happen. And I'm not saying every experiment will succeed. But I am saying this. When the world starts asking for neutral ways to move value under pressure without choosing sides, it becomes easier to understand why tools like XRP exist at all. Not because of belief, but because of fit. And that's where this finally lands for me. Repricing isn't about guessing outcomes, no matter how badly I want to do it. It's about noticing alignment between pressure and design, between need and infrastructure, between a world that is reordering itself and the tools that are being tested to hold this new world together. That's the lens that I'm using right now. It may change, but right now, this is what works. And I'm not doing this to predict anything, like I said, or even to persuade you of anything. Just to understand for myself what is quietly being built before the price is ever even forced to respond. And one last thing that I had to let go of. The idea that repricing is something that happens once. It isn't. Repricing never really ends. It's a constant process. Value being reevaluated as conditions themselves change. And those conditions are changing faster than most of us were taught to expect. Today, technology moves faster. Politics shift faster. Alliances form and loosen faster. Trust erodes and rebuilds faster. So repricing feels even louder right now. Hell, everything feels louder right now. Not because it's new, but because the world is moving more quickly. And it's moving more quickly than the systems we inherited that were designed for. That doesn't mean something is wrong. It actually means evolution is happening more often, more visibly, and closer to real time. That's also why understanding repricing matters so much. Not so I can predict outcomes, like I keep saying, and not so I can time anything perfectly, but so I don't mistake movement for manipulation or change for threat or even uncertainty for conspiracy. Repricing is simply how systems try to stay honest when the world around them just won't sit still. And the more familiar I am with that process, the less frightening it feels to live inside of it. If you're still here with me, that probably means you're not looking for hype. You're looking for language, for clarity, for a way to understand what is actually changing without being pushed into fear or even uncertainty. And that's what I'm building here. I use XRP as the lens, not to make predictions, but to understand what is happening in the world, how money is moving, how systems coordinate, and how value gets re-evaluated as the world quietly reorganizes itself. If this kind of exploration is useful for you, you can like, subscribe. It would mean the world to me. And also just keep walking through this with me. There's not any countdown clocks here, no price targets, just careful observation, clear language, and curiosity that things continue to shift. And as they continue to shift. Because repricing isn't coming, it's ongoing. And learning how to see it might be one of the most grounding skills that I can develop right now. Thank you for joining me. My name is James Harris, and this is Layer 1. And until the next episode, see you later.